The drone hovered over the withering cornfield, its camera capturing the stark reality of a farm on the verge of collapse. But neither the failing crops nor the foreclosure notices mattered to James Carter in that moment. What mattered was the mysterious woman, whose technological marvel he'd just repaired with nothing but baling wire and dashin. Intuition. As she stared at him with growing fascination, she reached for her phone. "I think you've just saved my project," she said, "and perhaps your farm too." James had no idea that in 6 weeks, his dying land would become the most advanced agricultural system in the country, or that his hands calloused from generations of traditional farming would help pioneer technology that would feed millions. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The August sun beat down mercilessly on James Carter's shoulders as he drove his ancient tractor across the eastern field of his farm. At 52, James had the weathered look of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors, his skin tanned and creased from decades under the sun, his hands calloused and strong from working the land. His father had worked this same soil, as had his grandfather before him. 3 generations of Carters had coaxed corn, wheat, and soybeans from these fields in rural Iowa, but none had faced the challenges that now threatened to end their legacy. James slowed the tractor to a stop and wiped sweat from his brow with a faded bandana. He scanned the rows of stunted corn that should have been chest-high by now, but barely reached his waist. The drought had been brutal this year, coming on the heels of 3 consecutive seasons of poor yields. The irrigation system he'd installed 10 years ago was failing, the equipment was aging, and the bank was running out of patience. The latest letter from Midwest Agricultural Bank had made their position clear. Without a significant payment by the end of harvest, foreclosure proceedings would begin. "Talking to the court again, Dad?" a voice called out. James turned to see his 24-year-old daughter, Lily, approaching on foot, carrying a thermos that undoubtedly contained iced tea. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite the dire circumstances of their farm, her eyes held the same determination that had gotten the Carters through hard times before. "Someone's got to encourage it to grow," James replied with a weary smile, accepting the thermos gratefully. "Lord knows the rain isn't doing the job." Lily leaned against the tractor tire, her expression somber. "I spoke with Ben at the co-op this morning. Grain prices are down again." James nodded, unsurprised. "Figures. Everything we sell gets cheaper. Everything we buy gets more expensive." He took a long drink of the tea, letting the cool liquid soothe his parched throat. "How are things at the veterinary clinic?" "Busy. Dr. Winters asked if I could pick up another shift this weekend." Lily had been working part-time at a veterinary clinic in town while taking online courses to finish her degree in agricultural science. Her wages had become an essential supplement to the farm's dwindling income. "You should take it," James said. "We can use every dollar." Lily hesitated. "But the north field needs weeding, and you were going to try to fix the irrigation pump again." "I'll manage," James insisted. "Your mother and I didn't put you through school so you could spend all your time pulling weeds." The mention of his late wife brought a momentary shadow across his face. Martha Carter had been gone for 5 years now, taken by cancer that had moved too quickly for treatment to make a difference. She'd been the heart of their home, the one who kept the books balanced and spirits high during the lean years. Without her, the farm felt hollow, even with Lily's determined presence. "Speaking of the irrigation system," Lily said, changing the subject, "I've been researching some more efficient options. There's a grant program through the State Agricultural Department for water conservation. Technology. Maybe we can apply." James sighed heavily. "More debt isn't the answer, Little. And you know how I feel about government handouts." "It's not a handout, Dad. It's an investment in sustainable farming practices." Lily's voice took on the passionate tone she got whenever discussing agricultural innovations. "The world is changing. We have to adapt. The Carters have been farming this land the same way for over 100 years," James replied stubbornly. "And maybe that's why we're struggling now," Lily countered, though her tone remained gentle. She understood her father's pride, his connection to tradition, but she also saw the writing on the wall. Small family farms like theirs were disappearing across the country, swallowed up by massive agricultural corporations with industrial farming methods that prioritized volume over quality. Before James could respond, a high-pitched whining sound cut through the air. Both father and daughter looked up to see a sleek white drone hovering about 50 feet above the cornfield. "What in tarnation?" James muttered, squinting against the sun. The drone moved methodically across the field, its camera clearly capturing images of the crops below. James felt a surge of indignation. Someone was surveying his failing crops without permission, probably from one of those big agricultural companies always looking to expand their holdings. They were like vultures, circling struggling farmers, waiting for bankruptcy to force a sale. "I'm going to see who's operating that thing," James said, climbing down from the tractor with surprising agility for a man his age. "Dad, wait," Lily began. But James was already striding toward the edge of the field, where the farm road met the county highway. As he approached the fence line, he saw a woman standing on the roadside, her attention focused on a tablet in her hands. She was dressed in lightweight hiking pants and a breathable long-sleeve shirt that suggested preparedness for outdoor work, rather than casual tourism. A wide-brimmed hat shaded her face, and a small backpack rested at her feet, alongside what looked like a compact equipment case. "Excuse me," James called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being the decision-maker on his land. "That's private property you're flying over." The woman looked up, seemingly unsurprised by his approach. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with striking features and an air of confidence that gave James pause. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that James couldn't quite place. "I'm conducting a regional soil and crop analysis. Your farm has an interesting topographical profile that makes it ideal for my study." James crossed his arms, unimpressed. Most folks ask permission before they start taking pictures of someone else's property. The woman removed her sunglasses, revealing intelligent eyes that assessed him with unexpected intensity. "You're absolutely right. That was presumptuous of me." She extended her hand. "Dr. Eleanor Chen. I'm with the Agricultural Innovation Institute." James hesitated before accepting the handshake, noting her firm grip. "James Carter. This is my farm you're surveying without asking." Dr. Chen nodded apologetically. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize. The Institute is conducting a comprehensive study of crop conditions throughout this region, and I should have sought permission first. May I have your consent to continue the survey? The data will be anonymized in our research." End quote. Before James could respond, the drone overhead made a sudden, alarming sound. Its smooth flight pattern faltered, and it began to drift sideways, losing altitude rapidly. "Oh no," Dr. Chen muttered, her attention snapping back to her tablet. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, but the drone continued its erratic descent. "Something's wrong with the stabilization system." The drone wobbled precariously, now only about 20 feet above the ground, and drifting toward the barbed wire fence that separated the farm from the road. In seconds, it would either crash into the fence or drop into the drainage ditch beyond it. Without thinking, James sprinted toward the fence line. As the drone made its final, uncontrolled dive, he lunged forward, arms outstretched. His hands closed around the sleek white body of the device, just before it would have smashed into the fence post. The momentum nearly pulled him into the barbed wire, but he managed to twist sideways, falling instead onto the soft earth at the field's edge. The drone clutched safely against his chest. "Mr. Carter," Dr. Chen called out, rushing toward him. "Are you all right?" James got to his feet, brushing dirt from his jeans with one hand, while carefully holding the Newsealand drone with the other. "I'm fine. Can't say the same for your flying camera, though." Dr. Chen reached him, concern evident on her face. "That was incredibly quick thinking. Thank you for saving it." She held out her hands to take the drone, but James was already examining it with curious eyes. "One of the propellers is damaged," he noted, turning the device over in his hands. "And there's something loose in the housing here." His calloused fingers probed gently around the drone's body. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Dr. Chen hesitated. "It's a rather expensive piece of equipment, Mr. Carter." "It's already broken," James pointed out. And I've been fixing machinery since before you were flying these things around. Promise I won't make it worse." After a moment's consideration, Dr. Chen nodded. "All right, I suppose it can't hurt." By this time, Lily had joined them, curiosity bringing her from her position by the tractor. "What happened?" "Dad just saved this woman's drone from becoming a very expensive fence ornament," James explained, already walking back toward the barn where his tools were kept. "Dr. Chen, this is my daughter, Lily." The two women exchanged greetings as they followed James across the field. Lily studied the stranger with undisguised interest. It wasn't often that scientists came to their rural community, especially not female ones who flew advanced drones. "What kind of agricultural research are you conducting?" Lily asked as they walked. "I'm studying the relationship between soil composition, water usage efficiency, and crop resilience," Dr. Chen explained, "particularly in areas affected by changing climate patterns." Lily's eyes lit up. "I'm actually working on my degree in agricultural science. My thesis is on sustainable farming methods for small-scale operations." "Is that so?" Dr. Chen smiled, genuine interest in her expression. "I'd love to hear more about your research. The future of agriculture depends on integrating traditional knowledge with new technologies." James listened to their conversation with mixed feelings as he led the way to the weathered red barn that had stood on the property for over 70 years. He was proud of Lily's intelligence and ambition, but talks of new technologies and sustainable methods often felt like criticisms of the farming practices that had sustained his family for generations. Yet he couldn't deny that those traditional methods were failing them now. Inside the barn, James cleared a space on his workbench and set the drone down carefully. The interior was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the August heat. The smell of hay, machine oil, and earth created the familiar scent that had been the backdrop to James's entire life. "This is a DJI Mavic 3 Pro, isn't it?" Lily asked, peering at the drone. "The agricultural modification version?" Dr. Chen looked impressed. "That's right, you know your drones." "Only from articles and videos," Lily admitted. "I've never actually used one." James had already gathered his tools and was examining the drone more thoroughly. "The propeller's an easy fix," he murmured, almost to himself. "But there's something more going on with the stabilization system." Using a small screwdriver, he carefully removed the damaged propeller and set it aside. Then, with practiced hands, he opened the drone's main housing to expose its electronic components. Dr. Chen watched with a mixture of concern and fascination as this weathered farmer handled her sophisticated equipment with surprising confidence. "The connection to the gyroscope has come loose," James announced after a few minutes of examination. "Probably from vibration over time. Your soldering job here wasn't the best to begin with." Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "I'm surprised you can identify that so quickly. Most farmers I know wouldn't be familiar with drone internals." "Most farmers you know probably didn't serve as a maintenance technician for Black Hawk helicopters before taking over the family farm," James replied without looking up. "The principles aren't so different, just smaller scale." He reached for his soldering iron, which he kept plugged in on the workbench for small repairs. As it heated up, he rummaged through a drawer and produced a small spool of solder. "I'm not sure if this is the right gauge for such delicate electronics," he muttered, examining the solder critically. "Let me see," Dr. Chen said, stepping closer. She took the spool from his hand, her fingers brushing against his momentarily. "This should work. The connection doesn't need to handle much current." James nodded and set to work, his large hands surprisingly deft as he reconnected the tiny wires to the circuit board. Dr. Chen leaned in to watch, and he was aware of her proximity, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the smell of hot solder. "You have a steady hand, Mr. Carter," she observed. "When you can't afford to replace things, you get good at fixing them," he replied, focusing on the delicate task. For the propeller, James had to improvise. The damaged blade couldn't be repaired, and he didn't have a replacement that would match the drone's specifications. After some consideration, he disappeared into the back of the barn and returned with a small piece of lightweight aluminum. "This won't be perfect," he told Dr. Chen as he began to carefully shape the metal into a rough approximation of the propeller blade. but it should get your drone flying long enough for you to get it back to wherever you came from. Using a combination of precise cutting, filing, and his own intuitive understanding of aerodynamics, James crafted a replacement propeller blade that, while not identical to the original, would serve its purpose. He balanced it carefully, making minute adjustments until he was satisfied, then attached it to the drone's motor. The entire repair took less than an hour. When James finally closed up the housing and tightened the last screw, he handed the drone back to Dr. Chen with a nod. Ready to test it. Can't guarantee it'll be as stable as before, but it should fly. Dr. Chen took the drone, genuine admiration in her eyes. That was impressive, Mr. Carter. We have technicians at the Institute who couldn't have done what you just did, especially not with such limited resources. James shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just a simple repair. They moved outside the barn, back into the sunlight. Dr. Chen placed the drone on a flat patch of ground and stepped back, tablet in hand. With a few commands, the drone's propellers began to spin, and it lifted smoothly into the air. Perfect balance, Dr. Chen murmured, putting the drone through a series of simple maneuvers. The calibration is spot on. She guided the drone back down to a gentle landing and turned to James with a wide smile. You've just saved me days of work and thousands of dollars. How can I compensate you for your time? James waved away the offer. No need. Glad to help. I insist, Dr. Chen pressed. At the very least, let me buy you and your daughter dinner. There must be a decent restaurant in town. James hesitated, his pride warring with practicality. They could certainly use the money for a proper repair fee, but there was something about taking payment for what he considered a simple neighborly act that didn't sit right with him. Lily, sensing his discomfort, stepped in. Honestly, Dr. Chen, just seeing that drone in action was payment enough for me. But if you really want to do something, maybe you could tell me more about your research? It sounds fascinating, and it could really help with my thesis. Dr. Chen considered this, then nodded with a smile. I'd be delighted. And please, call me Eleanor. She turned back to James. Mr. Carter, would it be imposing too much if I asked for permission to complete my survey of your fields? The data would be immensely valuable for my research. James looked out over his struggling crops, aware of how they reflected his failing as a steward of the land. Part of him wanted to refuse, to hide the evidence of his difficulties from this accomplished stranger. But another part recognized that his pride had often stood in the way of potential solutions. Go ahead, he said finally. Not much to see but struggling corn and soybeans, but you're welcome to look. Thank you, Eleanor said, her expression suggesting that she understood more than she was saying. May I come back tomorrow to conduct a more comprehensive survey? I'd like to take soil samples and moisture readings as well. James nodded his agreement, and they exchanged phone numbers to coordinate. As Eleanor packed up her equipment, Lily engaged her in an animated conversation about soil science and crop rotation strategies. James watched them, struck by how natural they seemed together despite their different backgrounds. His daughter belonged in that world of science and innovation, he realized, not tied to a failing farm out of obligation to family tradition. After Eleanor left, promising to return the next day, Lily turned to her father with excitement in her eyes. Do you realize who that was, Dad? Dr. Eleanor Chen is one of the leading agricultural technologists in the country. She developed a water-efficient irrigation system that's being implemented across drought-prone regions worldwide. James raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Didn't mention any of that while I was fixing her fancy drone. She's known for being humble about her accomplishments, Lily explained. I've read several of her papers for my classes. The fact that she's interested in our farm specifically, that could be significant. Don't get your hopes up, Lil, James cautioned. She's just collecting data for her research. Doesn't mean anything for us. But as they walked back to the house for supper, James found himself wondering about the strange coincidence that had brought Dr. Eleanor Chen to his farm on this particular day. He wasn't a superstitious man, but Gress. After years of bad luck, he couldn't help but feel that something important had just happened. That evening, as James sat at his worn kitchen table reviewing the farm's dismal financial statements, He couldn't shake thoughts of Eleanor Chen from his mind. There had been something in her eyes when she looked at his land, not pity, as he might have expected, but possibility. It was the same look Martha used to get when she saw potential where others saw only problems. The next morning dawned clear and hot, another rainless day that would further stress his crops. James was up her ass before sunrise, as was his habit, moving through the routines that had structured his entire adult life. Feed the few animals they still kept, check the irrigation system that was barely functioning, inspect the equipment that was held together more by determination than by properly functioning parts. Around mid-morning, a sleek silver SUV pulled up the dusty drive to the farmhouse. Eleanor emerged, dressed similarly to the day before but with equipment that looked more substantial than just the drone. James watched from the porch as she unloaded several cases and what appeared to be a collection of soil sampling tools. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she called, waving as she gathered her equipment. "James," he corrected, coming down the steps to help her. "Mr. Carter was my father." Eleanor smiled. "James, then. And thank you, but I can manage. I'm used to field work." Nevertheless, James took the heaviest case from her hands. "My mother taught me better manners than to watch a guest struggle with heavy equipment." Together they carried Eleanor's gear to the edge of the eastern field where they had met the day before. Lily joined them shortly, having arranged to start her shift at the veterinary clinic later so she could meet with Eleanor again. "I thought we'd start with soil sampling from various points across your property," Eleanor explained, laying out her equipment with practiced efficiency. "With your permission, I'd like to take readings from both the areas where your crops are struggling the most and where they're doing relatively better." James nodded his consent, and for the next few hours, he and Lily accompanied Eleanor across the farm's 160 acres. At each sampling location, Eleanor extracted soil cores, measured moisture, content, and took readings with various instruments, whose purposes James could only guess at. She also flew her drone in careful patterns over each section, occasionally stopping to make notes on her tablet. What impressed James most was that Eleanor didn't just collect data. She explained what she was doing and why. She discussed soil acidity, nutrient depletion, and water retention in terms that were technical but not condescending. She asked questions about the farm's history, what crops had been planted where over the years, what fertilizers had been used, when the problems had begun to appear. "Your soil structure has been significantly compromised," she noted as they examined a sample from the western field, where the corn was particularly stunted. "Years of conventional tilling practices have reduced organic matter and disrupted the mycorrhizal networks." James frowned. "My father and grandfather tilled this soil the same way for decades without issue. Environmental conditions were different then," Eleanor explained gently. "Rainfall patterns were more reliable, temperatures more moderate. What worked in the past may not be suitable for current and future conditions." It was a difficult truth to hear, but James couldn't deny the evidence before him. His crops were failing despite his best efforts using the methods he had been taught. As the day progressed, James found himself increasingly impressed by Eleanor's knowledge and approach. She wasn't just a theoretical scientist. She understood the practical realities of farming and spoke about them with respect for the generations of knowledge that farmers like him possessed. During a break, as they sat in the shade of a massive oak tree that had stood at the farm's center for longer than anyone could remember, Eleanor asked a question that caught James off guard. "What would you do differently if resources weren't an issue? If you could farm exactly as you believed was best?" James took a long drink from his water bottle, considering the question. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to think beyond survival, to envision what might be possible rather than simply what was necessary. "I'd restore the wetland area in the lower 40 acres, he said finally. "My grandfather drained it in the 40s to plant more corn, but it was never good cropland. Too wet in spring, too dry in summer." He gazed out over the fields, his mind's eye seeing not what was there, but what could be. "I'd implement a rotational grazing system for livestock to build back the soil. Plant more diverse crops instead of just corn and soybeans. Install a modern irrigation system that doesn't waste half the water we pump." Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. And what stops you? Money, James answered simply. Time. Knowledge, to some extent. The bank isn't interested in long-term sustainability. They want next quarter's payment. That's the tragedy of modern agriculture, Eleanor said. The systems that would be most resilient and profitable in the long run often require investment and transformation that seem impossible under current-day financial pressures. As the afternoon wore on, Lily had to leave for her shift at the veterinary clinic, but James continued to assist Eleanor with her research. There was something compelling about her methodical approach to understanding his craft. Land, as if she were reading a story written in the soil, and plants that he had never fully comprehended despite living with them his entire life. It was nearly sunset when Eleanor finally packed up her equipment. The western sky had turned a brilliant orange, casting long shadows across the fields, and getting even the struggling crops a golden dignity they lacked under the harsh midday sun. "Thank you for allowing me this access, James," Eleanor said as she closed the last of her cases. "The data I've collected today will be invaluable for my research." James nodded, suddenly reluctant to see her leave. It had been a long time since he'd spent a day in such engaging company. "Happy to help. Did you find what you were looking for?" Eleanor's expression turned contemplative. "Actually, I found something much more interesting than I expected." She gestured toward his hands. "You have remarkable skills, James. The way you repaired that drone yesterday with minimal tools and materials was extraordinary. And today, watching you read the land, knowing instinctively where water flows during heavy rains, which areas respond best to which treatments." She shook her head in admiration. That kind of integrated knowledge is precisely what's missing from most agricultural technology development. James shifted uncomfortably under her praise. "Just experience. Nothing special about it." "On the contrary," Eleanor insisted. "It's exceptionally special because it can't be programmed or manufactured. It has to be lived." She hesitated, then continued with what seemed like careful consideration of her words. "I'll be in the area for another week or so, continuing my research. Would it be possible for me to return for further observations?" James found himself agreeing before he had fully considered the implications. There was something about Eleanor Chen that inspired trust, despite her representing the world of scientific innovation that he had often viewed with skepticism. As she drove away down the dusty lane, her silver SUV incongruous against the weathered landscape of the farm, James stood on the porch wondering what had just happened. He had spent an entire day helping a stranger study his failing farm, and somehow, instead of feeling judged or diminished, he felt seen. Not just the struggles and shortcomings, but the potential that still existed in the land and in himself. That night, as he sat alone at the kitchen table with a simple dinner of sandwiches, Lily was working late. James found himself researching Dr. Eleanor Chen on his old laptop. The internet connection was slow, another luxury that the farm's finances couldn't justify upgrading, but eventually, he found information that confirmed what Lily had told him. Dr. Eleanor Chen was indeed a leading figure in agricultural technology. She had patents on several irrigation systems and soil amendment processes. She had published extensively on sustainable farming methods, climate-resilient crops, and the integration of traditional agricultural knowledge with cutting-edge technology. Most recently, she had founded an organization called AgriNova, which was developing what they called adaptive agricultural systems designed to transform struggling farmland into productive, sustainable operations. James read until his eyes grew tired, absorbing information about concepts that had seemed foreign to him just days before. Precision agriculture, soil microbiome enhancement, water-efficient drip irrigation, companion planting for pest management. Many of the principles aligned with practices his grandfather had followed before industrial agriculture had pushed farmers toward monoculture and chemical dependency. Over the next week, Eleanor returned to the farm 4 more times. Each visit followed a similar pattern. She would arrive with equipment, collect data, and engage James in long conversations about the land, farming practices, and the challenges facing rural communities. Sometimes Lily would join them when her schedule permitted, eagerly absorbing everything Eleanor shared. During one visit, Eleanor brought a specialized soil amendment, that she asked permission to test on a small plot of land. It's a microbial inoculant, she explained as she mixed the dark substance with water. It reintroduces beneficial fungi and bacteria that help plants access nutrients more efficiently. James watched with skeptical interest as she applied the mixture to a 10x10 section of struggling soybeans. And this is supposed to help them how exactly? Think of it as probiotic for your soil, Eleanor explained. Industrial agriculture has unintentionally created a sterile growing environment by killing off the microorganisms that plants evolved alongside for millions of years. This reintroduces those partnerships. James doubted that anything could salvage his crops at this point in the season, but he appreciated Eleanor's optimism. And if he was honest with himself, he also appreciated her company. There was something invigorating about her presence, about the way she combined scientific precision with genuine reverence for the natural systems she studied. On her 5th visit, Eleanor arrived with a proposal that would change everything. It was another brutally hot afternoon. James had spent the morning attempting to repair the irrigation pump again, with limited success. When Eleanor's now familiar SUV pulled up, he was covered in grease and frustration, his hands scraped from wrestling with rusted bolts. "Not a good time," he called as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag that was already too dirty to be useful. "Equipment problems." Eleanor nodded understandingly, but continued toward him. "Perhaps I can help. Before I specialized in agricultural systems, my first degree was in mechanical engineering." James raised an eyebrow, but stepped aside to let her examine the temperamental pump. Within minutes, she had identified the problem, a worn seal that was causing the system to lose pressure, and suggested a temporary fix using materials James had on hand. "That should hold it until you can get a proper replacement," she said as they tested the repaired pump, which now ran more smoothly than it had in months. "Thanks," James said, genuinely impressed. "You're full of surprises, Dr. Chen." Eleanor smiled, then gestured toward the farmhouse. "Do you have time for a conversation? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Curious, James led her to the porch, where 2 weathered rocking chairs offered a view of the fields stretching toward the horizon. He brought out glasses of iced tea, and they sat in momentary silence, taking in the landscape that, despite its current struggles, still held a certain majesty. "I've completed my analysis of the data I've collected from your farm," Eleanor began, her tone more formal than in their previous conversations. "And I've come to some conclusions that might interest you." James nodded for her to continue, a sense of both anticipation and dread building. Was she about to confirm that his land was beyond recovery? "Your farm has exceptional potential, James," she said, surprising him. "The underlying soil structure is sound, despite recent degradation. The topography is ideal for a diversified operation, with areas suitable for different types of production. The water table is relatively stable compared to many properties in this region. And most importantly," she turned to look at him directly, "it has a steward who understands it intimately and cares for it deeply." James shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct praise. "Doesn't change the fact that it's failing. It's struggling under current conditions and current methods," Eleanor corrected gently. "But with the right approach, I believe it could become not just viable, but exemplary." She set down her glass and turned fully toward him. "James, I'd like to propose a partnership." "Partnership?" he echoed, confusion evident in his voice. Eleanor nodded. "AgriNova, my company, has developed an integrated agricultural system that combines traditional farming wisdom with technological innovation. We've been looking for a test site to implement the full system somewhere with the right training, conditions, and, crucially, with a farmer who has both the practical skills and the openness to innovation necessary for success." James stared at her, trying to process what she was suggesting. "And you think that's here? Me?" "I do," Eleanor confirmed. "What I'm proposing is this. AgriNova would fund a complete transformation of your farm into what we call an adaptive agricultural system. New irrigation, soil remediation, diverse cropping patterns, integrated livestock, renewable energy, the whole package. In return, we would use the farm as a demonstration site for the next 3 years, bringing in researchers, and potential adopters to see the system in action." End quote. James's mind raced with questions and objections. "What happens after 3 years?" "The farm remains yours entirely," Eleanor assured him. "All improvements, all equipment. Our only request would be continued data sharing and occasional site visits for long-term research purposes." "And what would be expected of me during these 3 years?" "Your active participation as a partner," Eleanor said. "Your knowledge of this specific land is irreplaceable. We provide the technology and resources. You provide the hands-on expertise to implement it effectively. Together, we create a model that could be replicated on struggling farms across the country." End quote. It sounded too good to be true. James's natural skepticism surfaced. "What's the catch? What does AgriNova get out of this arrangement?" Eleanor smiled slightly, as if she'd anticipated the question. "Data. Validation of our system under real-world conditions. A showcase for potential investors and adopters. The opportunity to refine our approaches based on practical implementation. And," she added with unexpected earnestness, "the satisfaction of helping preserve a family farm that might otherwise be lost to corporate agriculture." James looked out over his fields, trying to imagine them transformed into the kind of operation Eleanor was describing. It was both exciting and terrifying to contemplate such radical change. "I'd need to think about it," he said finally. "Talk to Lily. This affects her future too." "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "Take all the time you need, but there is one time-sensitive aspect." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "The plot where I applied the microbial treatment last week? I took readings today." She handed him several photographs showing side-by-side comparisons of treated and untreated soybeans. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. The treated plants stood slightly taller, their leaves a deeper green. "1 week," James murmured, studying the images. "That's all it took to see a difference?" "The microbiome responds quickly when the right elements are reintroduced," Eleanor explained. "Imagine what could happen with a comprehensive approach over a full growing season." She left him with the folder of information about the proposed partnership, along with her direct number to call when he'd made a decision. As her SUV disappeared down the drive, James remained on the porch, the folder heavy in his hands. It represented something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. That evening, when Lily returned home, James shared Eleanor's proposal. He expected his pragmatic daughter to raise all the objections and concerns that had been swirling in his own mind, but instead, her eyes lit up with excitement. "Dad, this is incredible!" she exclaimed, paging through the materials Eleanor had left. "AgriNova is at the cutting edge of sustainable agriculture. Their systems have shown amazing results in test plots, but they haven't implemented a full-scale farm transformation before. This could be revolutionary, doll." "It could also be a massive disruption that leaves us worse off if it fails," James cautioned. "We'd be guinea pigs for unproven methods." Lily sat across from him at the kitchen table, her expression serious. "Dad, what are our alternatives? The bank is going to foreclose if we don't make that payment. The crops aren't going to miraculously improve with what we're doing now. This might be our only chance to save the farm." James sighed heavily, knowing she was right. The foreclosure notice sat in his desk drawer, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. "It just feels like giving up somehow. Admitting that the ways I've farmed all my life, the ways my father taught me, aren't good enough." "It's not giving up," Lily insisted. "It's evolving. Grandpa would have adapted too if he'd faced the challenges we're facing now." She reached across the table and put her hand over his weathered one. "This farm is your legacy, but it's my future. I want to be able to continue what our family started here, but that means finding new ways to make it work." James felt a lump form in his throat. Lily had never explicitly said she wanted to take over the farm someday. He'd assumed her education would lead her away from this difficult life, toward opportunities in cities where her intelligence and drive would be better rewarded. "You'd want to stay?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Even after seeing how hard it's been?" "This is home," Lily said simply. "And with what Dr. Chen is proposing, it could become the kind of farm I've been dreaming about, one that works with nature instead of constantly fighting against it." After Lily went to bed, James sat up late, rereading the proposal and researching AgriNova more thoroughly. Everything he found suggested that Eleanor Chen's company was legitimate and highly respected in agricultural innovation circles. Their technologies had won awards for sustainability and farmer-centered design. Their financial backing appeared solid, with investment from several reputable sources focused on climate-resilient agriculture. By morning, he had made his decision. He called the number Eleanor had provided, half expecting to reach a secretary or answering service, but she picked up on the second ring. "James," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Have you had time to consider our proposal?" "I have," he replied, suddenly nervous now that the moment of commitment had arrived. "Lily and I would like to move forward, if the offer still stands." "Excellent." Eleanor's enthusiasm was palpable, even through the phone. "I'll have the formal agreement drawn up immediately. In the meantime, would it be possible for me to bring a small team to the farm tomorrow? Our hydrologist and soil specialist should see the property firsthand before we finalize the implementation plan." End quote. James agreed, and the next morning found him watching as a team of 4 experts, led by Eleanor, conducted a more comprehensive assessment of his farm than he could have imagined possible. They used ground-penetrating radar to map underground water channels, deployed sensors to measure soil composition at various depths, and created detailed topographical models using drone imagery. "We'll use all this data to create a customized implementation plan," Eleanor explained as they gathered around the kitchen table at day's end, laptops open and maps spread across the surface. "Every aspect of the system will be tailored specifically to your land's unique characteristics." The team's soil specialist, the young woman with an Australian accent named Dr. Priya Kapoor, pointed to a map of the farm where different areas were color-coded. "Based on our analysis, we've identified 5 distinct ecological zones on your property. Each will receive a different treatment approach to maximize its natural potential." James listened with growing fascination as they outlined their initial recommendations. The lower 40 acres that he had mentioned wanting to restore as wetland would indeed return to that purpose, serving as a natural water management system and wildlife habitat. The eastern fields, where the soil was lightest, would be devoted to drought-resistant crops and nitrogen-fixing cover plants to rebuild fertility. The central areas with the best soil would continue in row crops, but with advanced water-efficient irrigation and companion planting strategies. The northern section would become a rotational grazing area for livestock, which would contribute to soil building through carefully managed grazing patterns. "And here," Eleanor said, pointing to a section near the farmhouse, "we propose establishing a high-yield market garden with season extension structures. It would provide another revenue stream through direct-to-consumer sales, while also serving as a compelling visual demonstration of the system's productivity." The transformation they described was more comprehensive than James had imagined, but as they explained each element and how it interconnected with the others, he began to see the vision of what his farm could become. It wasn't about abandoning traditional farming wisdom, but rather enhancing it with targeted technology and ecological understanding. The formal partnership agreement arrived 2 days later. James read it carefully, then had it reviewed by Frank Wilson, a lawyer in town who had been a friend of his father's. Frank found no hidden catches or concerning clauses. The terms were as straightforward as Eleanor had described. AgriNova would fund the transformation. James would actively participate in implementation and management, and after 3 years, everything would belong fully to him, while AgriNova retained rights to the data and demonstration access. Once the agreement was signed, things moved with astonishing speed. Within a week, trucks began arriving with equipment and materials. A team of workers set up a temporary headquarters in one of James's empty outbuildings, filling it with computers, monitoring devices, and scientific equipment that made it look more like a research station than a B&A. Farm building. The first phase focused on water management, which Eleanor explained was the foundation of the entire system. A specialized trenching machine began installing a network of underground sensors and precision irrigation lines that would deliver water exactly where it was needed, when it was needed, at rates determined by real-time soil moisture readings. "This system uses 70% less water than conventional irrigation," explained Miguel Rodriguez, the water systems engineer who oversaw the installation. And because it delivers water directly to the root zone, plants develop deeper, more resilient root systems. Simultaneously, work began on the wetland restoration in the lower 40 acres. Heavy equipment reshaped the land to slow and capture water flow, creating a series of shallow pools and marshy areas that would naturally filter and store rainwater that had previously rushed across the surface, carrying topsoil with it. By slowing the water, we're keeping nutrients and soil on your property instead of sending them downstream, Eleanor explained as they watched the excavator delicately sculpting the land according to natural contour lines. This area will become a sponge that holds water during wet periods and releases it slowly during dry times. Throughout it all, James was not a passive observer, but an active participant. Eleanor insisted that his knowledge of the land was essential to the project's success. When the installation team wanted to run irrigation lines through a certain area, James redirected them, explaining that the spot became a temporary pond during heavy spring rains. When the soil remediation plan called for a particular cover crop mix in the eastern field, James suggested modifications based on what had historically grown well in that soil. "This is the real innovation," Eleanor told him one evening as they reviewed the day's progress. "Not just the technology, but the integration of that technology with generations of practical knowledge." Lily threw herself into the project with even more enthusiasm than her father. Her background in agricultural science made her an ideal liaison between the technical team and the practical realities of the farm. She absorbed new information like a sponge, often staying up late studying the systems being implemented so she could better understand their management. As word spread about what was happening at the Carter farm, reactions in the community were mixed. Some neighbors watched with skeptical distance, convinced that the fancy new systems would fail when confronted with the harsh realities of farming. Others were cautiously curious, stopping by to observe the work and ask questions about the strange new equipment appearing across the fields. Ben Hansen, who ran the local agricultural co-op, visited several times, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to guarded interest. "Never seen anything like it," he admitted to James after watching a demonstration of the soil monitoring system that could detect nutrient levels in real time. "But these tech companies come and go. They promise the moon and deliver a handful of dust." Eleanor is different. James found himself defending her and the project. She understands farming, not just technology. She listens. Ben raised an eyebrow at the use of Eleanor's first name, but didn't comment on it. "Well, if anyone can make something like this work, it'd be you, James. You've always had good hands for machines." Not all reactions were so measured. Wade Richardson, whose massive industrial operation encompassed over 10,000 acres to the west, made a point of driving by one day in his luxury pickup truck. He rolled down the window as James was working near the road, installing sensors with one of the technicians. "Heard you've gone in for all that eco-farming nonsense, Carter," Wade called, a smirk on his ruddy face. "What's next? Healing crystals for the corn?" James straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just trying something new, Wade. Not all of us can afford to buy out our neighbors when our methods stop working." Wade's smirk faltered slightly. It was no secret that his operation had expanded by acquiring failing farms at rock-bottom prices. "Well, good luck with your science experiment. Let me know when you're ready to sell. I'll make you a fair offer." With that, he accelerated away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The encounter left James unsettled, though he couldn't exactly say why. Perhaps it was the reminder that not everyone would be rooting for this project to succeed. There were powerful interests invested in the status quo of industrial agriculture. 6 weeks into the transformation, the changes to the farm were becoming visible even to casual observers. The wetland area was taking shape, already attracting birds and wildlife that hadn't been seen on the property in years. The soil in the treated areas was visibly darker and more crumbly, evidence of increasing organic matter and microbial activity. Small green shoots were emerging from fields where cover crops had been planted to begin the soil restoration process. The most dramatic change, however, was the 5-acre market garden near the farmhouse. Using a combination of intensive planting methods, carefully selected varieties, and season extension structures, Eleanor's team had created an astonishingly productive space in what had previously been an unremarkable quarter of lawn and weedy pasture. This area alone will generate more net income per acre than conventional corn and soybeans, with a fraction of the inputs, Eleanor explained as she guided James through the rows of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. And because we're using regenerative methods, the soil improves each year instead of becoming depleted. James marveled at the abundance already evident, despite the late season start. I never would have thought this was possible here. That's the beauty of working with natural systems instead of fighting them, Eleanor said, kneeling to examine a thriving eggplant. When we create the right conditions, nature does most of the work for us. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, the setting sun casting long shadows across the transformed landscape, Eleanor's phone rang. She checked the screen and frowned slightly. I need to take this. It's our investor liaison. She stepped away, her conversation muted, but her body language suggesting the call wasn't entirely positive. When she returned, her expression was troubled. James, there's a situation I need to make you aware of. One of our major investors is getting nervous about the scale of this project. They're requesting an early demonstration for potential additional funders. I thought the funding was already secured for the full 3 years, James said, alarm rising. They were still in the early stages of implementation. Many of the systems weren't yet functional. It is, Eleanor assured him. This is about expanding to other sites more quickly than originally planned. But it means we need to accelerate some aspects of our timeline here. She hesitated. They want to bring a group of potential investors to the farm next week. I know it's sooner than we discussed having visitors, but it's important for the long-term vision of making this technology accessible to more farmers. James considered this. The farm was still in transition, with many areas looking more like construction sites than the harmonious agricultural system Eleanor had described. What would they expect to see? Reality, Eleanor said firmly. I'm not interested in staging a false demonstration. I want them to see the genuine process of transformation. With all its challenges and early successes, the market garden is already showing results. The soil remediation is visibly progressing, and the water management system is partially operational. It's enough to demonstrate the principles, even if the full impact isn't yet visible. End quote. James appreciated her honesty. Throughout the project, Eleanor had been transparent about both the potential and the limitations of what they were doing. She hadn't promised miracles, only sound ecological principles applied with technological precision. All right, he agreed. We can host your investors, but I want to be involved in the presentation. If they're going to judge what's happening here, they should understand the farmer's perspective too. Eleanor's face brightened with relief. I was hoping you'd say that. Your voice is crucial to this story. This isn't just about technology, it's about partnership with the people who know the land best. The investor visit was scheduled for the following Thursday. In the days leading up to it, the pace of work on the farm intensified. Areas that were further along in their transformation received finishing touches to make their progress more evident. The market garden was harvested and replanted strategically to showcase its productivity. The whiteland area, which had begun to take shape beautifully, was highlighted with a viewing platform where visitors could safely observe the ecological changes already underway. James found himself caught up in the preparations, surprising himself with his commitment to presenting the farm in the best possible light. This project had become more than just a desperate attempt to save his property. It had reignited his passion for farming in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The morning of the investor visit dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor tour. James dressed in clean work clothes, not the suit he might have worn for a bank meeting in the past, but clothes that reflected his identity as a working farmer, while still being presentable for important visitors. At 10 o'clock, a convoy of luxury vehicles pulled up the farm drive, which had been recently improved with fresh gravel. Eleanor greeted the visitors, a group of about 15 men and women in business attire that marked them as clearly out of place in rural Iowa. James watched from the porch, noting the way they looked around with expressions ranging from genuine curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. Eleanor led the group to a large tent that had been set up near the market garden, where presentations would begin before the farm tour. James joined them there, standing somewhat uncomfortably to the side as Eleanor introduced the project with a polished slideshow highlighting the principles behind the adaptive agricultural system. What makes this implementation unique, Eleanor was saying, is that we're not imposing a rigid template on the land. We're working with the specific conditions of this property and the generational knowledge of its steward. She gestured toward James. I'd like to introduce James Carter, whose family has farmed this land for 3 generations and whose practical expertise has been invaluable in adapting our technologies to real-world conditions. James hadn't expected to be called upon so soon, but as he stepped forward, he found words coming naturally. 6 months ago, I was on the verge of losing this farm, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. Drought, rising costs, falling prices, the same challenges facing thousands of farmers across the country. The methods that had sustained my family for generations weren't working anymore. He described the moment Eleanor's drone had crashed near his fence, the surprising partnership that had developed, and the transformation that was now underway. What's happening here isn't about replacing farmer knowledge with technology, he explained. It's about enhancing that knowledge with tools that help us work more effectively with natural systems instead of constantly fighting against them. As he spoke, James noticed one man in the group watching him with particular intensity. The man was older than most of the others, perhaps in his 70s, with silver hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent time outdoors. Unlike his companions, who wore business suits or smart casual attire, this man was dressed in a plaid shirt and khakis that wouldn't have looked out of place at the local diner. After the presentations, as the group prepared to tour the farm, this man approached James directly. Robert Morgan, he introduced himself, extending a hand. I was impressed by your perspective, Mr. Carter. James shook his hand, noting the calluses that suggested this was no ordinary investor. You have farming experience? Robert smiled slightly. I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, left for college, and never went back. My brother took over the operation, but I never lost my connection to agriculture. He glanced around at the visible changes to the landscape. What you're doing here interests me greatly. Not just the technology, but the integration of traditional knowledge with innovation. As the tour progressed, Robert stayed close to James, asking detailed, practical questions that revealed a surprising depth of agricultural understanding. He wanted to know about the farm's history, the specific challenges James had faced, and how the new systems were addressing those challenges. When they reached the wetland restoration area, Robert paused, taking in the transformation with evident appreciation. My father would have called this a waste of good farmland, he commented. But he also lost topsoil every spring when the snow melted and the rains came. Never made the connection. That's been my experience too, James admitted. We tend to see only what's right in front of us: this year's crop, this season's weather. It's hard to step back and see the larger patterns. Robert nodded thoughtfully. And that's where technology can help us, isn't it? Provide the data to see those patterns more clearly. By the end of the tour, James had developed a genuine respect for Robert Morgan, who seemed to understand both the practical realities of farming and the potential of technological innovation in a way that many of the other investors did not. As the visitors gathered for a closing reception featuring produce from the market garden, Robert sought out James again. You've taken a significant risk here, Mr. Carter, he said, gesturing at the transformed farm. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges generations of practice. Didn't have much choice, James replied honestly. It was change or lose everything. Sometimes desperation is the mother of innovation, Robert observed. But it takes courage to embrace new ideas, even in desperate times. He handed James a business card. I'd like to stay in touch, if you're amenable. I believe what's happening here has implications far beyond this one farm. James glanced at the card and felt a jolt of surprise. Robert Morgan was the founder and chairman of Morgan Tech, one of the largest agricultural technology companies in the world. Their equipment and software were used on farms across the globe, including by industrial operations like Wade Richardson's. You're that Robert Morgan? James asked, unable to hide his astonishment. Robert smiled modestly. The company has grown beyond anything I imagined when I started it, but I've become concerned about the direction of agricultural technology in recent years. Too focused on bigger, faster, more, without enough attention to sustainability and the human element. He looked around at the farm again. What Dr. Chen is doing here, with your partnership, represents an alternative path, one that I believe has tremendous potential. After the investors departed, Eleanor found James sitting on the porch, still processing the encounter with Robert Morgan. "How do you think it went?" she asked, joining him in the adjacent rocking chair. "Better than I expected," James admitted. They seemed genuinely interested, not just going through the motions. Eleanor nodded. Several expressed strong interest in increasing their investment, but Robert Morgan's engagement was unexpected. He doesn't often attend these kinds of demonstrations personally. He gave me his card. "NTA," James said, still somewhat disbelieving. "Said he wants to stay in touch." Eleanor's eyes widened. "That's significant. Morgan has enormous influence in agricultural technology circles. His support could accelerate acceptance of these systems dramatically." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the transformed landscape in golden light. The farm looked different now, not just because of the physical changes underway, but because both of them had begun to see it as it could be, not just as it had been. "Thank you," James said finally, his voice low. "For seeing something here worth saving." Eleanor turned to him, her expression soft in the fading light. "I didn't save your farm, James. You did, by being willing to evolve while holding on to what matters most. That's the hardest balance to strike, in farming and in life." There was something in her voice, a warmth that went beyond professional appreciation, that made James look at her more closely. Throughout their partnership, he had respected Eleanor's intelligence and vision, admired her practical knowledge alongside her scientific expertise. But in this moment, he realized that his feelings had grown into something more complex, something he hadn't anticipated when they first met. The realization both unnerved and energized him. At 52, a widower focused on saving his farm and supporting his daughter, romance had been the furthest thing from his mind. Yet here he was, aware of Eleanor not just as a brilliant agricultural innovator, but as a woman whose company he had come to value deeply. Before he could examine these feelings further, Lily's car pulled up the drive, returning from her shift at the veterinary clinic. The moment passed as Eleanor stood to greet her, shifting smoothly back into her role as project director. "How did it go with the investors?" Lily asked eagerly as she joined them on the porch. "Very well," Eleanor replied, including an unexpected connection with Robert Morgan himself. Lily's eyes widened. "The Robert Morgan? Dad, do you realize how huge that is?" James smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. "I'm beginning to get the picture." The three of them moved inside, where Lily had prepared a simple dinner before leaving for work that morning. As they ate together, discussing the day's events and planning for the next phases of implementation, James felt a sense of rightness that had been missing for too long. His farm was transforming, his daughter was thriving, and his own perspective was expanding in ways he could never have anticipated when Eleanor's drone had crashed by his fence 2 months earlier. The transformation of Carter Farm continued at an accelerated pace following the investor visit. Robert Morgan's interest had indeed been significant within days. Additional funding was approved to complete the implementation more quickly than originally planned. New equipment arrived, additional specialists joined the team temporarily, and the vision of an integrated, adaptive agricultural system began to materialize more concretely across the property. The wetland restoration was completed first, just in time for the fall rains. The system performed exactly as designed, capturing water that would previously have rushed across the fields, carrying away precious topsoil. Instead, it slowed the water's journey, allowing it to infiltrate the ground and recharge the local aquifer while creating habitat for birds, amphibians, and beneficial insects. "The diversity of wildlife returning to this area is extraordinary," noted Dr. Kapoor, the soil specialist, as she and James observed a great blue heron stalking through the shallows. "These species haven't been present here for decades, but they're returning as soon as the habitat is restored. My grandfather used to talk about the birds and frogs that lived in this area before it was drained," James recalled. "I never thought I'd see them return in my lifetime." Throughout the fall and into winter, Work continued on other aspects of the system. Advanced soil remediation techniques were applied across the fields, introducing beneficial microorganisms and organic matter to rebuild the soil's structure and fertility. Cover crops were established to protect the soil during the winter months and add nutrients naturally. The old, inefficient irrigation system was completely replaced with a precision drip system controlled by soil moisture sensors and weather forecasting algorithms. Solar panels were installed on the south-facing roof of the barn, providing renewable energy to power the new systems and significantly reducing operating costs. Perhaps most dramatically, a portion of the unused machine shed was converted into a state-of-the-art control center where data from across the farm was collected, analyzed, and translated into actionable blah. Management decisions. Lily took particular interest in this aspect, spending hours with the software engineers learning to interpret the streams of information coming from the hundreds of sensors now deployed across the property. "It's like the farm has become a living organism that can communicate with us," she explained to her father one evening, showing him visualizations of soil moisture patterns, nutrient flows, and microbial activity. "We can see things happening underground and make adjustments before problems develop, instead of reacting after symptoms appear in the plants." James found himself increasingly comfortable with the technology, especially as he saw how it enhanced rather than replaced his experiential knowledge. The sensors could detect moisture levels, but his understanding of how water moved across the specific contours of his land helped place those sensors in the most effective locations. The software could recommend planting dates based on soil temperature and weather forecasts, but his knowledge of local microclimate patterns helped refine those recommendations. As winter settled over Iowa, blanketing the transformed farm in snow, the implementation phase gave way to planning for the first full growing season under the new system. Eleanor remained a constant presence, dividing her time between the farm and AgriNova's headquarters in Chicago. Her expertise guided the integration of each component into a cohesive whole, while her vision kept everyone focused on the larger purpose of creating a model that could be replicated on farms facing similar challenges. During this planning phase, James and Eleanor's working relationship deepened into a true partnership of equals. They spent long hours at the kitchen table or in the new control center, discussing crop selection, rotational patterns, and management strategies. Their different perspectives often led to creative solutions that neither would have developed alone. "What if we interplanted clover with the corn?" James suggested one evening as they reviewed plans for the eastern field. "My father used to do that sometimes, said it kept the weeds down and the soil moist." Eleanor considered the idea thoughtfully. "The modern data supports your father's observation. Clover fixes nitrogen and creates beneficial microclimates for corn root development. Let's model that and see how it fits with the irrigation patterns we've established." These conversations gradually extended beyond farm management to broader topics: environmental policy, rural economic development, the future of farming in a changing climate. James found himself sharing thoughts and concerns he had rarely articulated, even to Lily. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, sometimes challenging his assumptions, but always respecting his perspective. Increasingly, they found reasons to continue these discussions over dinner in town or on walks through the transformed landscape, even when the specific planning tasks had been completed for the day. Neither acknowledged openly that these occasions were becoming something more than professional meetings, but the shift in their relationship was evident to those who knew them well. "You like her," Lily observed one evening after Eleanor had left following dinner at the farmhouse. It wasn't a question. James busied himself with clearing the dishes. "She's a remarkable person, brilliant, practical, visionary, and pretty," Lily added with a smile. "And single, from what I can tell." James felt a warmth creep up his neck that had nothing to do with the kitchen's temperature. "It's not like that. We're partners in this project, that's all." Lily replied, unconvinced. "That's why you put on a clean shirt and your good boots when you knew she was coming today." James changed the subject, but Louis's observation lingered in his mind. He had always considered himself too old and too practical for romantic entanglements, especially since Martha's death. His focus had been entirely on keeping the farm afloat and ensuring Lily had opportunities for a better future. The idea of personal happiness, of companionship beyond that of his daughter, had seemed like a luxury he could ill afford. Yet Eleanor had awakened something in him that he had thought long dormant: a capacity for intellectual passion, for seeing new possibilities, for imagining a future different from the past. Whether that awakening extended to romantic feelings was a question he wasn't quite ready to examine directly. As winter gave way to spring, the first real test of the new agricultural system approached. The planning was complete, the infrastructure was in place, and now it was time to put theory into practice with the first planting season. Unlike previous years, when James had planted corn and soybeans almost exclusively, this season would feature a diverse array of crops, strategically selected and positioned across the farm based on soil conditions, water availability, and ecological relationships. The eastern fields would grow drought-resistant grain sorghum, interplanted with legumes for soil building. The central areas would feature corn using a new water-efficient variety, developed specifically for the changing climate conditions of the Midwest. The western section would grow a carefully designed mix of cover crops, intended to rebuild soil health before transitioning to production the following year. The market garden near the farmhouse, which had continued producing through the winter using passive solar greenhouses, would expand significantly with the spring planting, offering a wide variety of vegetables, fruits, and flowers for direct sale to local consumers. "We've already got a waiting list for the CSA shares," Lily reported excitedly, referring to the community-supported agriculture program they had established over the winter. Local residents had eagerly signed up to receive weekly boxes of produce from the farm, providing an immediate market for the diverse crops they would be growing. Even more surprising had been the response from local restaurants and the small liberal arts college in the nearby town. Chefs and food service directors, who had previously sourced most of their produce from national distributors, were enthusiastic about accessing fresh, locally grown food, particularly when they learned about the innovative, sustainable methods being used. The day before spring planting was to begin, a special delivery arrived at the farm, a prototype of a new precision seeding machine developed by AgriNova specifically for diversified farming operations. Unlike conventional equipment designed for monoculture planting, this machine could handle multiple seed types simultaneously, placing them at varying depths and spacings according to a digital map of the field. "This is the first one off the production line," Eleanor explained as the delivery team unloaded it from a specialized trailer. "It incorporates many of the suggestions you made during the design review." James walked around the machine, admiring its elegant engineering. During the winter, he had consulted on several equipment designs, drawing on his practical experience to improve their functionality. This seeder represented a significant advancement. It would allow small and mid-sized farms to implement complex planting patterns without requiring multiple passes through the field or extensive hand labor. "It's beautiful," he said, running his hand along the frame. "Let's hope it works as good as it looks." The next morning, as dawn broke clear and cool over the farm, James, Lily, Eleanor, and the core implementation team gathered to begin the planting. There was a ceremonial quality to the moment, the first seeds going into soil that had been carefully prepared through months of remediation work, the first true test of whether their integrated vision could become reality. James took the controls of the new seeder, which had been calibrated and loaded the previous evening. The machine was connected to the farm's central computer system, which had generated precise planting maps based on soil conditions, topography, and the specific requirements of each crop variety. As he guided the seeder across the eastern field, following the GPS guidance system that ensured each seed was placed exactly where the plan indicated, James felt a profound sense of both continuity and change. He was performing the same essential act that his grandfather and father had performed on this land, planting seeds in spring soil, an act of faith in nature's cycles and human capability. Yet he was doing it in a way they could never have imagined, using technology that seemed almost magical in its precision and integration with natural systems. Eleanor walked alongside the seeder for the first few passes, monitoring its performance and making minor adjustments to the digital controls. Her presence beside him felt right, a physical embodiment of the partnership between traditional farming wisdom and technological innovation that defined their project. By mid-morning, A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the field, neighbors whose curiosity had finally overcome their skepticism. Agricultural extension agents interested in the new methods, and even a reporter from the regional newspaper who had heard about the transformation underway at Carter Farm. Wade Richardson, the industrial farmer who had mockingly predicted James's failure, drove by slowly, stopping to observe the operation from his truck. James nodded acknowledgement but continued his work, focused on the task at hand rather than on proving anything to skeptics. By the end of the week, all the planned areas had been planted according to the integrated design. Now began the waiting, that eternal agrarian patience required between planting and harvest. But unlike previous years, when James had been largely at the mercy of weather and pests, once the seeds were in the ground, the new systems provided unprecedented capability to monitor and respond to conditions as they became developed. The first evidence of success came faster than anyone had anticipated. The seeds germinated with remarkable uniformity and vigor, emerging from the soil more quickly and with greater strength than James had seen in recent memory. The soil amendments and careful preparation had created ideal conditions for germination, while the precision planting ensured that each seed was placed at exactly the right depth for its specific requirements. "The root development is extraordinary," Dr. Kapoor noted 2 weeks after planting, as she carefully excavated a seedling to examine its structure. "Look at these fine root hairs and the mycorrhizal associations already forming. The plants are developing resilient foundations that will serve them well through the growing season." As spring progressed into early summer, the differences between Carter Farm and neighboring properties became increasingly evident. While other farms showed the orderly but monotonous rows of conventional corn and soybeans, the Carter fields displayed a diverse patchwork of crops at various heights and colors, each selected for its ability to thrive in specific conditions and contribute to the overall health of the agricultural ecosystem. The weather that summer tested all farmers in the region. A prolonged dry spell in June was followed by intense thunderstorms in July that delivered too much rain too quickly for many fields to absorb. Yet the systems at Carter Farm performed as designed, minimizing the impact of these weather extremes. The precision irrigation maintained optimal soil moisture during the dry period, while the restored wetland and improved soil structure allowed the heavy rains to infiltrate rather than run off, preventing the erosion and waterlogging that affected many neighboring fields. By midsummer, the farm had become a regular destination for visitors interested in sustainable agriculture. University researchers, government officials, and farmers from across the country and even internationally came to see firsthand what integrated, adaptive agricultural systems could achieve. James, who had once been uncomfortable with public speaking, found himself regularly leading tours and explaining the principles behind what visitors were seeing. "The key is integration," he would explain. "Each element, water management, soil health, crop diversity, renewable energy, supports the others. It's not about any single technology, but about how they work together as a system, guided by both data and practical knowledge of the land." Eleanor often accompanied these tours, adding scientific context to James's practical explanations. Their complementary perspectives and evident mutual respect made a powerful impression on visitors, many of whom commented on the effective partnership they had developed. "You two make quite a team," remarked an agricultural official from Washington after a particularly comprehensive tour. "It's rare to see this kind of integration between advanced technology and hands-on farming experience. We've learned from each other," Eleanor replied, exchanging a smile with James that conveyed more than her words. That's been the most valuable aspect of this project. As harvest time approached, anticipation built among everyone involved with the Carter Farm project. The crops had developed beautifully, displaying a health and vigor that exceeded even the optimistic projections in the original plans. Soil tests showed significant improvements in organic matter content, microbial activity, and nutrient availability, providing quantitative evidence that the regenerative practices were already having measurable effects after just one growing season. The market garden had been providing a steady income throughout the summer, with the CSA program and restaurant partnerships proving even more successful than anticipated. Lily had taken primary responsibility for this aspect of the operation, revealing a talent for both growing specialty crops and managing the business relationships that supported their distribution. "We've already got a waiting list for next year's CSA shares," she reported during a planning meeting in early September. "And Chef Marcus at Harvest Table wants to feature our farm in a special farm-to-table dinner series this fall. He says our produce is changing how he thinks about cooking. But the real test would be the main field crops, the corn, sorghum, and other grains that represented the bulk of the farm's acreage and had traditionally provided its primary income." While the innovative methods had clearly produced healthier plants, the ultimate measure would be yield and quality at harvest time. The first harvest day dawned clear and cool, perfect conditions for bringing in the grain sorghum from the eastern fields. James prepared the harvesting equipment, which had been modified to accommodate the diverse cropping patterns and to collect data that would feed back into the farm's monitoring systems. Eleanor and several key team members were present for this significant milestone, as were a few neighboring farmers whose skepticism had gradually given way to cautious interest. As the combine moved through the field, the yield monitors immediately showed results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The sorghum was yielding nearly twice what conventional methods had produced in that same field 3 years earlier, before the worst of the drought conditions had set in. Moreover, the grain quality was exceptional, with higher protein content and fewer impurities than typical harvests. "The interplanting with legumes made all the difference," Eleanor observed as they examined the preliminary data. The nitrogen fixation supported the sorghum growth, while the different root structures allowed both plants to access soil resources more efficiently. James nodded, studying the healthy grain flowing into the collection bin. And the precise irrigation meant neither crop experienced stress during critical development phases. Similar results followed with each subsequent harvest. The corn yielded 40% more than the county average despite using 60% less water and chemical inputs. The specialty grains grown in the northwestern section commanded premium prices from organic processors due to their exceptional quality and verified sustainable production methods. By the time the final crops were harvested in late October, the comprehensive data painted an undeniable picture of success. Carter Farm had become more productive, more resilient, and more profitable than it had been in decades, while simultaneously improving its environmental impact. Soil health metrics showed significant recovery, water usage had decreased dramatically, biodiversity had increased across the property, and carbon sequestration measurements indicated the farm was now a net carbon sink rather than a source. The financial implications were equally transformative. For the first time in years, James was not only able to make the bank payment with ease, but also to begin repaying debts that had accumulated during the struggling years. The diversified income, streams field crops, specialty products from the market garden, educational tours, and consulting fees from farmers interested in implementing similar methods created a financial resilience that matched the ecological resilience they had built into the land. "We did it," James said quietly to Eleanor, as they stood together on the porch one evening after the final harvest had been completed. The setting sun cast a golden light over the transformed landscape, highlighting the visible changes that 1 year of intensive regenerative management had already produced. "I still can't quite believe it." Eleanor smiled, her expression blending professional satisfaction with a more personal warmth that had grown between them. "We did. But this is just the beginning, James. The systems will continue to improve, the soil will keep building, the ecosystem will become increasingly resilient. What you're seeing now is just a glimpse of what this farm can become." "What we're seeing," he corrected gently, turning to face her more directly. "This wouldn't have happened without you. You saw potential here when all I could see was failure." Eleanor shook her head. "I provided tools and techniques, but you provided the wisdom to apply them effectively, and the courage to try something radically different. This farm is a reflection of your commitment to it." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the light fade across the fields that now represented not just a family legacy preserved, but a vision for agricultural future demonstrated. "So what happens now?" James asked finally. "The implementation phase is complete. The first full growing season has exceeded expectations. Does that mean your work here is done?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested, and both of them knew it. The partnership that had begun with a crashed drone had evolved into something neither had anticipated: a deep connection based on shared values, complementary knowledge, and growing personal affection that both had been careful not to name explicitly. That depends, Eleanor replied carefully. Professionally, AgriNova will continue monitoring and data collection as agreed in our contract, but my personal intensive involvement was always expected to diminish after the first full implementation cycle. She paused, then added more softly, but I've been considering relocating the company's research division closer to actual farming regions. Chicago is convenient for corporate headquarters, but there are advantages to having research and development closer to the land we're working to transform. James felt his heart rate quicken slightly. This area would certainly offer affordable land for a research facility, he noted, trying to keep his tone casual. And there's a growing interest in agricultural innovation among younger farmers in the region. Those are certainly compelling professional considerations. Eleanor agreed, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that suggested they were discussing something more than business logistics. But there are personal factors in such a decision as well. Before James could respond, the sound of a car on the gravel drive interrupted the moment. They turned to see Robert Morgan's distinctive vehicle approaching, an unexpected visit that momentarily shifted their attention from the conversation's unspoken implications. "I hope I'm not intruding," Robert called as he emerged from his car. "I was passing through the area and wanted to see how the harvest turned out." James welcomed him warmly, genuinely pleased to see the man whose support had accelerated the farm's transformation. "Your timing is perfect. We just completed the final harvest yesterday. The results have exceeded all projections." "So I've heard," Robert replied with a smile. "Word is spreading about what you've accomplished here." They gave him an impromptu tour of the farm in the fading light, showing him the harvested fields now planted with winter cover crops, the expanded market garden with its season extension structures, and finally the control center where all the farm's data was collected and analyzed. "Remarkable," Robert said, as he studied the comprehensive displays showing the farm's productivity, resource efficiency, and ecological metrics. "And all of this in just 1 year of implementation. The foundations were already here," Eleanor explained. "Good land, experienced management, community connections. We just provided the tools to unlock its potential." Robert nodded thoughtfully. That's always been the missing piece in agricultural technology, recognizing that innovation isn't about replacing human expertise, but enhancing it. He turned to James. "What you've demonstrated here has implications far beyond this one farm. It's a model that could be replicated on thousands of struggling operations across the country." "That was always the goal," James acknowledged. "Though honestly, at the beginning, I was just trying to save my own farm. The bigger picture came into focus later." "That's often how significant change happens," Robert observed. "We solve our own problems in new ways, and suddenly we realize those solutions have universal applications." He glanced at Eleanor. "I understand AgriNova is considering establishing a rural research center based on the success here?" Eleanor nodded, though she seemed slightly surprised by his knowledge of discussions that were still preliminary within the company. "We're exploring the possibility. Being closer to working farms would allow for more direct collaboration with the agricultural community." "I think it's an excellent strategy," Robert said. "In fact, that's partly why I stopped by today. I'd like to discuss a potential partnership between Morgan Tech and AgriNova to scale up what you've accomplished here. My company has the manufacturing capacity and distribution networks to make these systems accessible to farmers nationwide, while your team has the ecological expertise and farmer-centered design approach that's been missing from conventional ag tech." End quote. The conversation continued over dinner at the farmhouse, with Lily joining them after returning from her veterinary clinic shift. The discussion ranged from specific technical improvements to broader visions of how regenerative agriculture could revitalize rural communities while addressing climate challenges. "The key is that it has to make economic sense for farmers," James emphasized. "All the environmental benefits in the world won't matter if families can't make a living implementing these methods." "Precisely," Robert agreed. "And that's what makes your farm such a powerful demonstration. You've shown that regenerative methods can be more profitable than conventional approaches, not just more sustainable. By the time Robert departed, the outlines of a significant collaboration had been sketched, one that would maintain AgriNova's independent research focus, while leveraging Morgan Tech's manufacturing capabilities to make the integrated systems more affordable and accessible to farmers of all sizes. That was unexpected, Eleanor said, as she and James stood on the porch, watching Robert's taillights disappear down the dark country road. But potentially transformative for how quickly these methods could spread. He sees the bigger picture, James observed. Not just technology for its own sake, but technology in service of communities and landscapes. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliantly visible away from city lights. Neither seemed eager to end the evening, despite the long day behind them and the early morning that farming always demanded. "You never answered my question," James said finally, his voice quiet in the darkness. "About what happens now. For you. For us." Eleanor turned toward him, her face partially shadowed in the porch light. "The professional answer is clear enough: continued collaboration, expanding the model, sharing what we've learned. But I think you're asking about something else." James nodded, summoning the courage to speak directly about feelings that had been growing for months. "This partnership has become more than I ever expected, Eleanor. Not just the farm transformation, but—" He hesitated, then continued with determination. "But my own transformation. The way I see the future now. The possibilities I can imagine. And a lot of those possibilities include you, in ways that go beyond professional collaboration." Tash. In the pause that followed, he felt a moment of doubt, wondering if he had misread the subtle signals or overstepped a boundary in their carefully maintained professional relationship. Then, Eleanor reached out and took his hand, her touch sending a current of warmth through him despite the cool evening air. "I feel the same way, James. This project brought me here, but something deeper has kept me coming back, looking for reasons to extend my visits, finding new aspects of the farm that needed my personal attention." "And did they need your personal attention?" James asked, a smile in his voice. "Some did," Eleanor admitted with a small laugh. "But mostly, I needed to be here, with you, watching you embrace new possibilities while honoring your family's legacy, seeing how you've mentored Lily while giving her space to find her own path." "Taff." She squeezed his hand gently. "Agricultural innovation may have been my professional focus, but human connection is what gives it meaning." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the step they had just taken settling between them with the rightness of something long anticipated finally acknowledged. "So, about that research center location," James said eventually, his tone lightening. "I hear there's good land available in this area, and at least one local farmer who might be interested in continued collaboration." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright in the quiet night. "Is that so? Well, I'll have to look into that possibility very thoroughly. It would be a significant decision after all." "Very significant," James agreed, his voice growing more serious. "For both of us. I'm not exactly the easiest project you've taken on, Eleanor. Set in my ways, stubborn as Iowa soil in August, and yet remarkably adaptable when presented with compelling evidence," she countered. "That's a rare quality, James. The ability to honor tradition while embracing necessary change." She turned to face him fully. "Besides, I like a complex, long-term project. The challenging ones are always the most rewarding." Under the vast, starry sky that had witnessed generations of Carters working this land, they sealed their new understanding with a kiss that felt both like a beginning and a continuation, the natural evolution of a partnership founded on mutual respect that had blossomed into something deeper. The following spring found Carter Farm buzzing with activity beyond even the previous year's transformation. Construction had begun on the AgriNova Rural Research Center on 20 acres adjacent to the farmland that James had purchased from a retiring neighbor using profits from the remarkably successful first year of regenerative operation. The research center would serve as a hub for developing and testing new agricultural technologies specifically designed for small and mid-sized diversified farms. It would bring a dozen high-skilled jobs to the community initially, with plans to expand as operations grew. Eleanor had indeed relocated, dividing her time between the new research center and a modest farmhouse she had purchased just down the road from the Carter property. Lily had taken on an expanded role in the farm's operations, officially becoming a partner in the business while continuing her education in agricultural science. Her particular focus had become the integration of livestock into the regenerative system, with a small herd of heritage cattle, now rotationally grazing across designated portions of the property, contributing to soil building while providing another income stream. The farm itself continued to evolve, with each season building on the success of the previous one. Soil health metrics showed steady improvement, biodiversity increased across the property, and production efficiency continued to rise as the integrated systems matured. The market garden had doubled in size to meet growing demand, and a small on-farm store had been added to accommodate customers who wanted to purchase directly from the source. Perhaps most significantly, Carter Farm had become a center for farmer-to-farmer education. Every month, James hosted field days, where other farmers could see the systems in action and learn how to implement similar approaches on their own operations. These events consistently drew participants from across the region and increasingly from around the country, as word spread about the remarkable transformation that had occurred. The most important thing to remember, James would tell these visiting farmers, is that this isn't about following a rigid formula. It's about understanding the principles and then adapting them to your specific land, climate, and circumstances. The technology supports your decision-making and it doesn't replace it. This message resonated particularly with farmers who had felt marginalized by conventional agricultural systems that seemed designed primarily for the largest industrial operations. Here was an approach that valued their knowledge and experience while providing tools to enhance their effectiveness and resilience. The partnership between AgriNova and Morgan Tech had formalized into a joint venture called Adaptive Agricultural Systems, with the specific mission of making regenerative technologies accessible to farms of all sizes. Under Robert Morgan's guidance, the venture focused on modular, scalable systems that could be implemented incrementally as farmers' resources allowed, rather than requiring massive capital investment all at once. Wade Richardson, the industrial farmer who had once mockingly predicted James's failure, had become a reluctant visitor to the field days, his curiosity eventually overcoming his skepticism as the evidence of success became undeniable. While not ready to transform his entire operation, he had begun implementing some of the water conservation and soil building techniques on portions of his vast acreage. "Never thought I'd see you here," James commented during one such visit. The old tension between them softened by time and changing circumstances. "Gotta keep an eye on the competition," Wade replied with a gruff attempt at humor. "Besides, my son's been pestering me about all this regenerative stuff since he got back from ag college. Figured I should at least know what he's talking about." It was a small concession, but indicative of the gradual shift occurring throughout the agricultural community, as evidence mounted that regenerative methods could be both ecologically and economically superior to conventional approaches. 3 years after Eleanor's drone had crashed by James's fence, exactly the time frame specified in their original agreement, a special gathering was held at Carter Farm to mark the official completion of the demonstration project. Agricultural officials, university researchers, farmers, and community members gathered to celebrate what had been accomplished and to hear about the next phases of development. Standing together at the podium set up near the market garden, James and Eleanor presented the comprehensive results of the 3-year transformation. The data was compelling. Soil organic matter had increased by 4%. Water use had decreased by 65%, while yields had increased by an average of 35% across all crops. Biodiversity measures showed a 300% increase in beneficial species, and the farm's net income had more than quadrupled due to both increased production efficiency and diversified revenue streams. But the numbers, impressive as they are, don't tell the full story, James told the assembled crowd. This farm was failing 3 years ago, not just financially but ecologically. The methods I had inherited, that had worked for generations, were no longer sufficient in a changing climate and economic landscape. What this project has demonstrated is that we don't have to choose between honoring traditional farming wisdom and embracing innovation. The most powerful approach is to combine them." End quote. Eleanor then outlined the next phases of research and implementation that would be centered at the new facility adjacent to the farm. "What began as a single demonstration project has evolved into a movement," she explained. "Farmers across the country are proving that regenerative methods can work at every scale, in every region, for every type of operation. Our goal now is to make these approaches even more accessible, more adaptable, and more effective." After the formal presentations, as attendees toured the farm and research center, James found a quiet moment with Eleanor near the old oak tree that had witnessed the entire transformation. 3 years, he mused, looking out over the vibrant, diverse landscape that had once been struggling monoculture fields. Hard to believe so much has changed in such a relatively short time. "The land responds quickly when we work with natural patterns instead of against them," Eleanor observed. "It's been waiting for us to remember how to be good partners." James nodded, then turned to her with a more personal reflection. "It's not just the farm that's transformed. I was stuck in so many ways, financially, mentally, emotionally. Trying to farm exactly like my father and grandfather, even though the world had changed. Isolating myself after Martha died, instead of building new connections." He took Eleanor's hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "You didn't just bring new farming methods, Eleanor. You helped me see possibilities again." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes reflecting the depth of feeling that had grown between them. "And you showed me that all my research and innovation meant nothing without connection to the people and places it was meant to serve." We transformed each other, James. From that hillside vantage point, they could see Lily leading a group of young farmers through the market garden, her confidence and expertise evident in her animated gestures and the attentive expressions of those following her. Near the new research center, Robert Morgan was deep in conversation with several agricultural officials, likely advancing their shared vision for scaling regenerative approaches. The farm buzzed with activity, purpose, and the unmistakable energy of a place where meaningful work was being done. "So what's next for us?" Eleanor asked, echoing the question James had posed that evening after the first successful harvest. "The formal demonstration project is complete. The research center is established. The farm is thriving. Where do we go from here?" James smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that reached his eyes and softened the weather-worn lines of his face. "Well, I've been thinking about that. This partnership has worked out pretty well so far. Might be worth making it more comprehensive." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Are you proposing a merger, Mr. Carter? Because I should warn you, I have very specific requirements for any such arrangement." "Is that so, Dr. Chen?" James replied, his tone playful but his eyes serious. "And what might those requirements be?" "Mutual respect, shared vision, independent operation with integrated purpose," her voice softened, "and absolute commitment to continued growth and adaptation, both individually and together." "Those terms sound acceptable," James said, drawing her closer. "Though I expect we'll need to negotiate the details over time." "The best partnerships evolve," Eleanor agreed, her expression tender as she looked up at him. "Just like the best farms." Around them, the transformed landscape of Carter Farm stretched out in all directions, living proof that decline could become renewal, that struggling systems could become thriving ones, that seeming endings could become remarkable beginnings. The land that had sustained generations of Carters had found new vitality through the unlikely partnership that began with a crashed drone and a farmer's clever hands. As they rejoined the celebration, moving among people whose lives and lands would be touched by what had been demonstrated here, James and Eleanor carried with them the quiet certainty that their most important harvests both on the farm and in their relationship were still to come. The seeds had been planted, the conditions had been created, and now they would nurture these new beginnings with the same care and commitment they had brought to transforming a struggling farm into a vision of agriculture's future. The story of Carter Farm would continue to unfold, No longer a tale of decline and potential loss, but one of innovation, resilience, and the remarkable possibilities that emerge when traditional wisdom and technological advancement find common purpose in the fertile ground of mutual respect. In a world where division often dominated headlines and discourse, the partnership that had transformed this place offered a different narrative, one where apparent opposites became complementary strengths, where past and future formed a continuous thread rather than competing alternatives, and where the simple act of fixing a broken drone led to healing broken systems, renewing a family legacy, and creating connections that would sustain both land and people for generations to come. As the sun began to set on the celebration, casting long golden rays across the vibrant patchwork of Carter Farm, James stood with Eleanor at his side, Lily nearby sharing her expertise with eager listeners, and the community gathered in appreciation of what had been accomplished. In that moment, surrounded by the tangible results of vision made real through partnership, he felt something he had almost forgotten during those struggling years: the deep, abiding satisfaction of being not just a farmer, but a steward, not just preserving a legacy, but enhancing it for those who would come after. And all because a woman with a drone had crashed into his life, challenging him to see possibilities where he had only seen problems. Sometimes, James reflected, as he looked at Eleanor with gratitude and love, the most important seeds we plant are the ones we never anticipated, the chance encounters and unexpected partnerships that grow into transformations more profound than we could have imagined. Those were the harvests that sustained the heart as surely as crops sustained the body. And at Carter Farm, both were now flourishing in a harmony that promised to endure through seasons yet to come.